Imagine standing in a battlefield where the ground is soaked with blood, the air reeks of gunpowder, and the cries of the wounded echo in the distance. This is America in the 1860s, torn apart by the brutal Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of men would never return home, yet the stories that emerged from this war were not only about the living or the dead. Soldiers began to whisper about strange sightings, phantom armies marching through the mist, fallen comrades appearing once again in battle, and ghostly generals leading troops long after their deaths. Were these visions merely illusions born of exhaustion and fear, or were there truly ghost soldiers haunting the battlefields of America's darkest war? The 1860s were among the darkest decades in American history. It was a time when a nation divided itself into two. The northern states and the southern states stood against each other in a bitter conflict. The immediate cause was slavery, but in truth, the war was about much more: power, politics, economy, and dominance. This was a war where brother turned against brother, friends became enemies, and the entire country sank into blood and fire. From 1861 to 1865, the Civil War raged across America. It wasn't just a war, it was an apocalypse for those who lived through it. Estimates suggest that more than 600,000 people died in just 4 years. Thousands of women were widowed, countless children were orphaned, and entire towns were destroyed. The stench of gunpowder clung so heavily to the air on battlefields that breathing became difficult. Places that once were lush fields turned into graveyards of corpses, blood, and rusting weapons. The soldiers who fought this war weren't professional warriors. They were farmers, laborers, and ordinary citizens, suddenly thrust into unimaginable horror. They didn't just fight the enemy, they fought hunger, disease, and crippling exhaustion. Winter nights were so brutal that men would heat their boots over open flames just to keep their feet from freezing. Many soldiers never fell to bullets or bayonets, but instead to starvation, dysentery, and pneumonia. The battlefield was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Soldiers would watch their closest friends die in agony before their eyes, screaming, writhing, and then falling silent forever. But the true terror came days later, when some claimed to see those same friends again. The same faces, the same uniforms, walking across the battlefield as if death had not touched them. For those who witnessed it, it was not only shocking, it was terrifying. The first whispers of ghost soldiers began during these years. Eyewitnesses spoke of shadowy figures dressed in military uniforms, marching in formation at night, only to vanish suddenly into the mist. Several soldiers swore that the figures they saw were their fallen comrades, men they had buried just days before. These chilling sightings spread fear among the ranks, as if the war itself was summoning back the dead. Imagine standing in a field where the haze of gunpowder still hangs in the air, where the cries of the dying echo around you, and suddenly, you see your dead friend standing there. The same uniform, the same weapon in his hand, but his eyes, empty and hollow, no longer human. These were the unbearable moments soldiers described, moments that blurred the line between the living and the dead. Some tried to explain it as exhaustion, as the mind playing tricks under immense stress. But the question haunted everyone: if it was only an illusion, how could multiple soldiers witness the same ghostly figure at the same time, in the same place? On more than one occasion, entire groups reported seeing phantom regiments marching silently through the darkness. This was the birth of the ghost soldiers. At first, these stories spread in whispers, passed quietly from one campfire to another. Men laughed them off, calling them drunken tales or battlefield nerves. But as the war dragged on, the whispers turned into collective fear. These were no longer rumors, they were testimonies, witnessed by dozens, sometimes even hundreds of men. The American Civil War didn't just scar the land with blood, it scarred the minds and spirits of those who lived through it. Perhaps that's why these ghostly soldiers remained, manifestations of trauma, or perhaps something more. To many, the idea of ghost soldiers was not superstition, but the lingering truth of a war so horrific that even death could not end it. In the summer of 1863, the small town of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania became the stage for one of the bloodiest battles in American history. Over the course of 3 relentless days, July 1 to July 3, Union and Confederate forces clashed in a struggle that would change the fate of the Civil War. By the time the smoke cleared, nearly 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, or simply vanished into the chaos of war. Gettysburg was not just a battlefield, it was a slaughterhouse, a place where human life was shredded in the name of victory. Witnesses described the aftermath as a scene straight from hell. Fields once green and peaceful were now painted red with blood. Horses lay scattered alongside men, their bodies grotesquely twisted in death. Trees were shattered by cannon fire, their trunks splintered into deadly shards. The stench of decay spread quickly, and survivors walked through seas of corpses, searching desperately for their friends. For those who lived, the memories of Gettysburg would never fade. But it wasn't just the physical horror that haunted Gettysburg. Something else lingered there, something beyond human understanding. Within days of the battle, soldiers and townspeople alike began reporting strange sightings. Phantom figures dressed in torn, blood-stained uniforms appeared at night. Some stood silently in formation, as though waiting for orders. Others marched endlessly across fields where entire regiments had perished. One of the earliest stories came from Union soldiers who claimed to see an entire Confederate unit marching across a ridge late at night. The men prepared their weapons, thinking the enemy had returned. But as they watched, the figures glowed faintly, their outlines shimmering in the moonlight. When the soldiers advanced, the ghostly regiment dissolved into the mist. Not a single footprint remained on the ground. Another chilling tale comes from a farmer's daughter who lived near Gettysburg. One evening, as she carried water back to her home, she froze in horror. A line of soldiers in ragged uniforms marched past her, their faces pale, their eyes lifeless. She dropped the bucket and screamed, but the men didn't react, they simply kept walking, vanishing one by one into the fog. For years afterward, she swore that what she saw was no dream. But perhaps the most famous ghost of Gettysburg is not a soldier at all. Many visitors, even in modern times, claim to have seen the figure of President Abraham Lincoln himself. It is said that Lincoln's spirit returns to Gettysburg because of the immense grief he carried for the lives lost there. After all, it was Gettysburg where he delivered his most iconic words, the Gettysburg Address, a speech honoring the dead and urging the nation to heal. Could his restless spirit still walk the fields, mourning the price of unity? For soldiers who fought at Gettysburg, the idea of ghosts was no longer a superstition. Men swore they heard phantom drums beating at night, as if unseen armies were still marching into battle. Others reported voices calling their names in the darkness, voices that belonged to comrades long dead. Some men even claimed that ghostly hands tugged at their uniforms while they slept, as though the fallen were begging not to be forgotten. Psychologists today might explain these experiences as trauma, hallucinations born of grief and exhaustion. But skeptics face a problem. How do you explain identical stories told by people who never met, in different times, across decades? Tourists, historians, and paranormal investigators have all walked the fields of Gettysburg and come away shaken by what they experienced. Some hear footsteps behind them when no one is there. Others capture faint figures on film or in photographs, figures dressed in uniforms from the 1860s. Gettysburg is often called the most haunted battlefield in America. To this day, people travel from across the world not only to honor the history, but to encounter the whispers of the dead. Some visitors describe it as sorrowful, a place filled with grief that has never lifted. Others find it terrifying, convinced that the spirits of Gettysburg are still fighting a war that ended over 150 years ago. In truth, perhaps Gettysburg cannot rest. Too much blood was spilled, too many young lives ended in pain. The echoes of battle cling to the soil, the air, and the very stones of the town. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, Gettysburg stands as a reminder of a time when America tore itself apart. And for those who walk its fields at night, the question remains, are the shadows they see mere imagination, or the restless dead, forever bound to the battlefield? When the Civil War finally ended in 1865, America breathed a sigh of relief. The guns fell silent, the armies disbanded, and the country began the slow and painful process of rebuilding. But while the war had ended on paper, for many, the battlefield never truly disappeared. Too much blood had been spilled, and too many lives had been torn away for peace to settle easily. The war had left scars not only on the land, but on the very spirit of the nation. In towns across the South and the North, widows dressed in black walked the streets, clutching photographs of husbands who would never return. Children cried at night for fathers who had been buried far away. Cemeteries grew faster than towns, and thousands of graves remained unmarked because there were simply too many dead to identify. For those who had survived, every broken building, every scorched farm, and every quiet night carried memories of the horrors they had seen. But some survivors spoke of something else. Something more disturbing than memory. They claimed the dead had not truly left. One Union veteran, years after the war, recalled marching along a country road at dusk when he saw figures up ahead. He thought at first it was another patrol, but as he drew closer, he realized the men were dressed in faded, blood-soaked uniforms, their faces pale and lifeless. They carried rifles but marched without sound. Before he could speak, the figures vanished into the air. He later confessed he could not sleep for days, convinced that he had seen the ghosts of his fallen comrades. Farmers and townsfolk reported hearing the sounds of battle long after the war had ended. Gunshots, cannon fire, and the cries of men echoed across empty fields. At times, riders on horseback appeared out of nowhere, only to fade into the mist seconds later. On several occasions, travelers swore they encountered entire regiments on the road, men who looked exhausted, hungry, and desperate. But when they tried to approach, the soldiers dissolved like smoke in the wind. Churches, too, became places of strange activity. In some towns, parishioners claimed they saw shadowy figures kneeling at pews, men in torn uniforms, praying silently. Priests reported hearing footsteps in empty halls, or the sound of someone weeping when no one was there. It was as if the spirits of the soldiers were still searching for comfort, still looking for forgiveness, still waiting for peace. In battlefields like Shiloh, Antietam, and Chickamauga, the legends grew even stronger. Chickamauga, in particular, gained a reputation for being one of the most haunted battlefields of all. Soldiers who camped there years later claimed to see glowing figures in the woods, their rifles slung across their shoulders, marching endlessly in circles. Locals whispered about the blue light of Chickamauga, a mysterious glow that would float across the fields at night. Some believed it was the souls of soldiers searching for their lost regiments. Others said it was a cursed energy born from so much death in one place. But it wasn't only ordinary soldiers who were said to appear. Stories spread of ghostly generals riding across battlefields long after they had been buried. In Tennessee, witnesses claimed to see a man on horseback, dressed in full Confederate uniform, galloping through the night with a sword raised high. His face was stern but pale, and his eyes glowed like burning embers. Many believed it was the ghost of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, forever leading a charge that would never end. The hauntings were not limited to the South. In Washington, D.C., the White House itself became a place of ghostly activity. Visitors and staff reported seeing the ghost of Abraham Lincoln walking its halls, his tall figure appearing at night, his expression sorrowful. During World War II, both Winston Churchill and Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands claimed to have encountered Lincoln's spirit in the White House. It seemed that the war president, burdened by the deaths of so many, could not rest in peace. For ordinary people, these stories were both terrifying and strangely comforting. On one hand, the idea that the dead still walked among the living was frightening. On the other, it meant that those who had fallen had not truly been forgotten. Their presence lingered, a reminder of sacrifice, suffering, and the terrible cost of war. Even today, more than 150 years later, many Americans believe the spirits of the Civil War still walk the land. Paranormal investigators travel to old battlefields with cameras and recorders, hoping to capture voices or images of ghost soldiers. Tourists visiting places like Gettysburg, Antietam, or Chickamauga often leave with chilling stories, cold touches on their skin, whispers in the dark, or photographs showing shadowy figures in the background. The Civil War may have ended, but for some, its soldiers still march. They march through the fields where they fell, through the towns they once defended, and through the memories of a nation that can never forget. Perhaps these spirits are not trapped. Perhaps they are simply reminders, eternal witnesses to a time when America nearly destroyed itself. Their presence ensures that the pain of war is never fully erased, and that the cost of division is never forgotten. More than a century and a half has passed since the last shots of the American Civil War echoed across the land. The nation healed, rebuilt, and grew into a global power. Cities rose where battlefields once lay, and highways cut through land that had once been soaked in blood. Yet, the war has never truly faded from memory. It lingers not only in history books and monuments but, some say, in the shadows of the very fields where it was fought. The legends of ghost soldiers continue to thrive, not because of superstition alone, but because they capture something deeply human. These stories are about memory, grief, and the idea that great suffering leaves an imprint too strong to vanish. For every historian who dismisses ghostly tales as folklore, there is a witness who swears by what they saw. The accounts may differ, but the core remains the same: soldiers who died in unimaginable agony still walk the earth. Across America, ghost tours lead curious visitors through old cemeteries, abandoned hospitals, and scarred battlefields. Gettysburg remains the most visited, drawing thousands each year not only for its history but for the chance to glimpse the supernatural. Tourists have reported photographs showing phantom figures, recordings filled with ghostly voices, and sudden chills in warm summer air. Guides tell of ghostly regiments marching across hills, their boots silent but their presence undeniable. At Antietam, one of the deadliest battles of the war, visitors claim to hear the sound of drums and gunfire when the fields are otherwise silent. At Chickamauga, stories of the blue light persist, glowing orbs drifting through the trees where thousands fell. In Shiloh, fishermen on the Tennessee River tell of ghostly soldiers standing on the banks at night, staring out across the water as though waiting for transport that will never come. The White House itself remains a place of ghostly legend. Abraham Lincoln, perhaps the most burdened soul of the Civil War, is said to walk its halls to this day. Presidents, foreign leaders, and ordinary staff have all spoken of his tall, shadowy figure appearing in moments of national crisis, as though his spirit continues to guard the nation he fought to preserve. If Lincoln himself cannot rest, then perhaps it is no surprise that his soldiers cannot either. But what do these legends mean for us today? For many, they are reminders that war leaves scars beyond the battlefield. The Civil War was not just fought with bullets and cannons, it was fought with human lives, dreams, and futures. Every ghost story carries the weight of a real person who lived, who loved, and who died too soon. These tales force us to remember that history is not abstract, it is made of people, each with a story that deserves to be told. Psychologists suggest that ghost stories are a way for society to process trauma. The Civil War was so brutal, so destructive, that perhaps the human mind created these legends to give form to its grief. But others argue that there are simply too many accounts, too many shared experiences, to dismiss them as imagination. How do we explain soldiers in the 1860s seeing the same apparitions that tourists and investigators still report today? Perhaps there truly are things beyond our understanding, remnants of souls that cannot move on. In a way, the ghost soldiers of the Civil War have become immortal. They live on in stories, in whispers, and in the eerie silence of battlefields where nothing grows quite the same. Their presence ensures that the sacrifices of the past are never completely forgotten. For every chilling tale of a phantom regiment, there is a reminder of the human cost of division, hatred, and war. Even now, late at night, visitors standing alone on Gettysburg's fields describe a heavy stillness, as though thousands of unseen eyes are watching. Some say they hear footsteps behind them, or faint voices calling through the wind. Others walk away convinced that the ground itself remembers, that the earth holds the memories of the dead and releases them to those who dare to listen. The Civil War may have ended in 1865, but its soldiers march still, in memory, in legend, and, perhaps, in spirit. They are the eternal guardians of history, walking reminders that the price of unity was paid in blood. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the ghost soldiers of the Civil War endure as symbols of sacrifice, sorrow, and the haunting truth that some wars never truly end. And so, the question remains, when you walk the silent fields of Gettysburg, Antietam, or Chickamauga, and feel a chill brush against your skin, will you dismiss it as the wind, or will you wonder if you, too, have been touched by the restless dead?